In the autumn of 1780, the American Revolution was dying. After 5 long years of war, the southern colonies were collapsing under the British war machine. A string of devastating Patriot defeats, especially at Charleston and Camden, had left the cause for independence in tatters. The British seemed unstoppable. Their strategy to pacify the South and then roll northward to crush the rebellion for good was on the verge of success. Leading the charge was a commander as brilliant as he was arrogant, a man who was about to make a fatal miscalculation. He believed he could break the will of the American frontier with a single terrifying threat. He was wrong. That man was Major Patrick Ferguson, a Scottish officer who was, remarkably, the only British regular commanding an army of over 1,000 American Loyalists. From his camp in North Carolina, he sent a paroled prisoner into the Appalachian Mountains with a chilling ultimatum for the frontier settlers, those rugged individualists known as the Overmountain Men. If they didn't cease their opposition to the king, he vowed he would, quote, march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and lay their country waste with fire and sword. He thought he was crushing the last embers of rebellion. Instead, he had just ignited a firestorm. By 1780, the war had shifted south. British High Command was convinced the Carolinas and Georgia were full of citizens still loyal to King George III. The plan, put into motion by the formidable Lord Charles Cornwallis, was simple. March north from his victory in South Carolina, rally the Loyalists to his banner, and extinguish the rebellion colony by colony. Protecting the western flank of Cornwallis's main army was Major Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson was no ordinary officer. He was an innovator, a gentleman, and one of the finest marksmen in the British Army. But his brilliance was matched by a blinding arrogance and a deep-seated contempt for his enemy. He saw the backcountry Patriots not as soldiers, but as a rabble of peasants, calling them the dregs of mankind. His mission was to suppress these militias and recruit for the crown, a task he dove into with ruthless efficiency. His force was uniquely American. He was the only British regular on the field, leading a provincial corps of American Loyalists against their own countrymen. The war in the South wasn't some distant conflict between empires. It was a brutal, intimate civil war, pitting neighbor against neighbor. And Ferguson was about to make it intensely personal. Ferguson's threat wasn't just a boast. It was a declaration of total war against the families of the frontier. The Overmountain Men he threatened were a different breed of American. They were Scots-Irish, German, and English settlers who had pushed west over the Appalachian Mountains into what is now Tennessee, defying a British proclamation that forbade it. They were hunters, farmers, and survivors, living a hard life on the edge of the known world. These weren't continental soldiers. They were self-reliant militia, fiercely independent and deeply resentful of any authority that tried to control them. When Ferguson's message arrived in their settlements along the Watauga and Holston rivers, it wasn't met with fear, but with incandescent rage. This wasn't some far-off political squabble. It was a direct threat to their homes, their families, and their entire way of life. Ferguson had dismissed them as barbarians, but he had completely failed to understand their character. He had poked a hornet's nest, and the swarm was about to rise. The leaders of the Overmountain settlements, men like the resolute Isaac Shelby and the charismatic John Sevier, knew they had no choice. They couldn't wait for Ferguson to bring fire and sword to their doorstep. They had to take the fight to him. The response was immediate and overwhelming. On September 25, 1780, at a place called Sycamore Shoals, a massive force of militia began to gather. They came from the valleys of Virginia and the settlements of modern-day Tennessee and the Carolinas. Colonel William Campbell arrived with 400 Virginians. Isaac Shelby and John Sevier brought nearly 500 more from the Overmountain territories. They were joined by hundreds of militiamen from the Carolina Piedmont, all burning with a desire for revenge. This wasn't an army in the European sense. It was a posse, a tidal wave of frontiersmen, united by one single purpose: to hunt down and destroy Patrick Ferguson and his army. They had no uniforms, no supply train, and very little formal discipline. They traveled light, with bedrolls, pouches of cornmeal, and their most prized possession, the American long rifle. This weapon was what gave them a fighting chance. while Ferguson's Loyalists were armed primarily with smoothbore muskets and bayonets, designed for volley fire on open fields. The Overmountain Men carried rifles. Slower to load, the rifle was far more accurate, a deadly tool in the hands of a frontier hunter who knew exactly how to use it. They set off on a grueling march, covering over 200 miles through the rugged, snow-dusted Appalachian Mountains. They were a relentless, self-sufficient force, driven by righteous fury. They were, in their own words, resolved to go into battle and die, if necessary, to protect their homes. As the Patriots marched, Ferguson became aware of the massive force gathering to oppose him. For a moment, his arrogance wavered, and he began a retreat towards the safety of Cornwallis's main army in Charlotte. But then, his pride got the better of him. Tempted by the prospect of a glorious, decisive victory, he made a fateful decision. He would make his stand. He chose his ground carefully, a long, narrow, rocky ridge that rose abruptly from the surrounding countryside. It was called King's Mountain. From its summit, the slopes fell away steeply on all sides, covered in woods and boulders. Ferguson believed the position was impregnable. He reportedly boasted that he was the king of that mountain, and that God Almighty could not drive him from it. He encamped his 1,000 Loyalists along the cleared summit, setting up only basic defenses, and confidently awaited the attack he had dared the Patriots to make. On October 6th, the Patriot leaders got word of Ferguson's location. At a place called Cowpens, South Carolina, they made a critical decision. They chose their 900 best marksmen with the strongest horses for a final, desperate pursuit. They rode through a cold, rainy night, covering the last 35 miles without any rest. By the afternoon of October 7th, they had arrived at the base of King's Mountain. Silently, they dismounted, leaving men to guard the horses. The commanders gave their final, chilling orders. "Let each one of you be your own officer," they said. And then, "Shout like hell and fight like devils." The Patriot plan was a model of frontier warfare. Simple, brutal, and deadly effective. They split into 8 detachments, surrounding the ridge in a massive U-shape, sealing off any chance of escape. Using the dense woods and large boulders for cover, they began to creep up the slopes, a ring of vengeful ghosts closing in on Ferguson's exposed position. The battle began around 3 p.m. with the single crack of a rifle that echoed across the ridge. From all sides at once, the Patriots opened fire. War whoops and shouts erupted from the woods as the frontiersmen advanced from tree to tree, pouring a devastatingly accurate fire into the Loyalist ranks massed on the barren summit. Ferguson, ever the professional soldier, responded with textbook tactics. Astride his white horse, blowing sharp blasts on his silver whistle to direct his men, he ordered a bayonet charge. The Loyalists, with their terrifying steel, charged down the slope, forcing one of the Patriot groups to fall back. But the frontiersmen didn't break and run like Ferguson expected. Instead, they just melted back into the forest, used the trees as cover, and as soon as the charge lost its steam, they turned and resumed their deadly fire on the now exposed Loyalists. This became the gruesome pattern of the battle. The Loyalists would charge with bayonets, and the Patriots would retreat. The Loyalists would return to the summit, and the Patriots would surge forward again, firing from all sides. The wooded terrain that Ferguson had so foolishly ignored completely negated his forces' main advantage and played directly into the Patriots' strengths. It was, as one Patriot later said, like shooting fish in a barrel. The noose grew tighter and tighter. After just over an hour of relentless, suffocating combat, the battle reached its climax. The Patriots swarmed the summit from multiple directions, overwhelming the exhausted and terrified Loyalists. The ring had closed. Ferguson, realizing the position was lost, attempted one last, desperate act of defiance. With a few loyal officers, he mounted a charge, trying to slash his way through the Patriot line and escape. It was a fatal mistake. A wall of Patriot riflemen rose up and unleashed a furious volley. Ferguson was struck by as many as 8 bullets, his body torn apart by the fusillade. He was dragged by his horse into the Patriot lines, where he died just moments later. With their commander dead, the remaining Loyalists began to surrender, throwing down their weapons and raising white flags. But for many patriots, the fight wasn't over. Screaming, "Tarleton's Quarter!" A reference to a previous massacre of surrendering patriots by the British Colonel Banastre Tarleton, they kept firing into the huddled masses of Loyalists. It took the desperate intervention of Patriot officers, physically restraining their own men, to finally stop the slaughter. The battle was over. The American Patriots had won a stunning, total victory. For the Patriots, the cost was 28 dead and 62 wounded. For the Loyalists, the result was utter annihilation. Over 200 were killed, another 163 were wounded, and nearly 700 were captured. Ferguson's entire army had been wiped off the map. The aftermath was grim. On the march away from the battlefield, the Patriots held swift trials, convicting 36 Loyalists of various crimes and hanging 9 before Colonel Shelby finally put a stop to the proceedings. The victory at Kings Mountain wasn't just a successful battle. It was a profound strategic shock that echoed across the colonies. The news reached General Cornwallis, who, having now lost his entire western flank, was forced to abandon his invasion of North Carolina and retreat back into South Carolina to regroup. The momentum of the war in the South, which had been with the British for so long, had suddenly and violently shifted. The battle shattered Loyalist morale and recruitment in the region, while breathing new life and hope into the Patriot cause. Years later, Sir Henry Clinton, the overall British commander in America, would call the defeat at Kings Mountain the first link of a chain of evils that followed each other in regular succession until they at last ended in the total loss of America. Thomas Jefferson was more succinct. He simply called it the turn of the tide of success. The vengeful frontiersmen, the Overmountain Men who had been provoked by one man's foolish arrogance, hadn't just won a battle. They had saved the revolution in the South and helped set the stage for the final British surrender at Yorktown just 1 year later. If you found this story of backcountry vengeance and revolutionary triumph as fascinating as I do, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of history's most pivotal battles. And let me know in the comments, what other overlooked turning points of the American Revolution should I cover next? Thanks for watching.